Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Reading Within Reach and Global Reading Network's webinar series, Early Grade Reading Program Design and Implementation, Best Practices and Resources for Success. My name is Allison Flexen. I work for URC, which supports Reach in the Global Reading Network. And I'm very excited to have everyone here today for this fifth installment in our webinar series. REACH is an initiative supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development and implemented by University Research Company, which is based just outside of D.C. in Maryland. REACH supports the Global Reading Network and acts as a form of secretariat to collaborate with the members of the Global Reading Network to develop and share research, program experiences, and resources related to early grade reading improvement. And if you haven't already, check out the GRN website at globalreadingnetwork.net. It has undergone some enhancements lately, and we have a lot of new resources that we posted there recently, along with webinar materials and presentation materials. So it's really a great resource for those of you implementing early grade reading programs. I'd like to acknowledge my co-presenters for this webinar series. Amy Palangio, a REACH technical advisor based in Tanzania. She's co-facilitating today's webinar, and she's also presented in the webinars the previous weeks. Arasar Limo, the REACH training and curriculum specialist, presented a few weeks ago on early grade reading program resources. And Adrian Barnes of Florida State University, who also presented with us earlier in the series on early grade reading skills and instruction. So I'd just like to thank and acknowledge all the hard work of the team in putting this together. We also have, of course, many people on REACH who support our work. Stephanie Kenner has been helping to run these webinars and provide support. She's at the GRN IT name here that you'll see. She's supported by someone new to REACH, Katie, who will also be online, and she helps to answer anybody's logistical or IT questions. So thank you to them as well for helping these webinars to run smoothly. So the goal of this webinar series has been to provide all of the diverse actors who work on early grade reading programs with a summary of the latest research, guidance, best practices, and resources related to the design, implementation, and expansion of effective early grade reading initiatives. We know there's a lot of people doing many amazing things, and we hope this is an opportunity to share what people are doing, to distill some of those successes we're having and best practices, and to help share recommendations as many of these programs continue to expand to other countries and to also expand within countries. So each session is focused on a key technical topic and includes a summary of research, a summary of some of the experiences around that particular area, and some best practices. So if you haven't already checked out the previous webinars, we hope you'll do so to see some of the information. All of the webinars address cross-cutting issues. Some of those are gender equity, issues related to technology, inclusive education, which we know is a really important priority, and rightly so, of USAID and many other donors and stakeholders. How are we making sure our programs are reaching all learners and in an integrated way? So we don't want to really silo these issues, but we want to address them as we're addressing the topic generally. Every webinar has also touched on monitoring, evaluation, and sustainability, also how we expand and scale up our programs. We'll be talking about that quite a bit today when we think about professional development for teachers, other education actors, and in particular, the use of coaching to support teachers in the classroom. We understand that the nature of the webinar sometimes makes it difficult for interaction and sharing, but we've really tried hard to build in opportunities throughout to pause, reflect, take comments from you through the chat box. We found in the past that this has really worked well when people are able to share challenges that they're having that we can answer, hopefully answer some of your questions. You can hear from colleagues as well about experiences they have that might be similar in what they're doing. So please speak up in the chat box, because that's what really has enriched these webinars in the past when people get involved that way. So here's a list of the first 4 webinars in the series with the dates. All of these materials are available online at the Global Reading Network website. And today, of course, our topic is continuous professional development in early grade reading programs. So we're excited to wrap up this series with what we know is a really important issue to everyone implementing these programs. Okay, so we're going to dive into things. I'm first going to introduce my co-presenter, Amy Polanjo. Amy Polanjo has more than 25 years of experience working in education, program development, and international program implementation with her focus and passion on literacy. She is based in Tanzania, as I mentioned, where she works as an independent consultant. Amy first assumed her role with REACH as a technical consultant back in 2016. She's also served as a technical consultant for organizations including Creative Associates, the International Literacy Association, the Global Center for Learning and Innovation, and World Learning. And she's been all over the globe doing literacy work in countries including Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, Haiti, Kenya, and Nepal, to name a few. Amy was previously the vice president of a US-based educational professional development organization called the Collaborative for Teaching and Learning, and she was a literacy assessment specialist with Measured Progress. Amy earned her Master of Education as a clinical reading specialist and a Bachelor of Education in K-12 education and arts education. And she has additional training in program evaluation and program management. So I'd like to welcome Amy.
Thank you, Allison. I'm checking the audio.
We hear you very well, Amy. Thank you.
Wonderful. It's also my pleasure now to tell you a little bit more about Allison, who'll be co-presenting with me today. Allison Flepson is the REACH Reading Program Specialist. She supports the design and development of resources and professional development opportunities for the Global Reading Network. Allison has 15 years of experience designing and managing education-related programs in sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to joining REACH, she worked for 6 years at RTI International, where she helped to design and implement early grade literacy programs, assessments, training manuals, and resources. And one area of particular interest to Allison is language use in education, which she presented on last week in this series, particularly as language relates to reading and language learning. So thank you, Allison, and I'm pleased to be presenting with you today.
Amy is going to now lead us into the presentation.
So here you can see an overview of the session. These are the objectives for your participation today. Take just a moment to look at it, please. So we're going to be looking at continuous professional development as it relates to training, coaching, and also delving a little bit into additional kinds of learning communities and teacher self-study and reflection, those kinds of things. But primarily, we'll be focused today on training and coaching. We're going to look at the kinds of content that are necessary in reading for continuous professional development, not just for teachers, but for other educational stakeholders as well. Evidence on what is most effective in terms of approach to professional development, and the knowledge and skills that providers need to have, and how to train on those skills in leadership as well. Lastly, looking at how do you plan, implement, and as Allison noted, the integration of monitoring and evaluation into the discussion of continuous professional development as well. Taking a look at how can you monitor from front end to back end, not only the implementation of continuous professional development, but then the impact of it as well. I want to pause for just a second to send a thank you out to Marian Fessmeyer. Marian worked with us on the original iteration of this series, and this particular presentation was in large part put together by Marian. So we want to say thank you to her today for her work on this. So throughout the session, we're going to be using the chat box. If you have any trouble finding it, look to the bottom of your screen where you see the little bubble and chat. And if you click on that, you should see the chat box come up on the right side. When you use the chat box during activities or to ask any questions, you need to make sure that you are responding to all panelists and attendees. Over on the right side at the bottom, you will see a blue bar and it should say all panelists and attendees. If it does not, you can click on that and you can send it to that icon of all panelists and attendees. So as we move into this idea of continuous professional development, what we're really talking about is a multifaceted kind of ongoing process that prepares teachers to have the knowledge and skills that they need, and to implement the strategies that are important to help all students learn. Multiple modalities of learning for teachers, but also multiple modalities of learning for other educators. So we're not just talking about one-off training, we're not just talking about formal training situations, but the broader gamut of long-term continuous professional development. Continuous professional development is also the bridge between implementing some new initiatives and the extent that they become embedded in the classroom. One of the things we really know is that training alone is massively insufficient for teacher change, and that it really requires long-term supported interaction with teachers around their practices, the ability to reflect on those practices in order to push teachers toward the kind of positive changes they'd like to make for their instruction in the classroom. So we're actually going to begin today by asking you to talk to us. So you should see an activity on your screen, Continuous Professional Development Approaches in Early Grades Reading Programs. We're going to be using the Zoom chat window and take a look at the prompt that's on the screen. Think about the kinds of approaches you have designed, implemented, or even just participated within in EGR programs for continuous professional development. What were the different kinds of activities that were done? What did you find to be most successful? If you were an implementer, what was most successful for your participants? If you were a participant, what was most successful for you? And what kinds of challenges did you find in those settings as well, or in other settings? If you've had other settings where there were challenges in continuous professional development, what are those and how did you navigate those? So Delia is commenting first, of course, on workshops about new program methodologies for early grades reading. Participation in workshops. Or Delia, were you an implementer of those workshops? School-based literacy coaches, coming from Maddie, to support teachers in co-teaching within the classroom. Maddie, can I ask you a question? Were those coaches supplemental to the school building, or were they selected from within the teaching staff? And then Elizabeth notes a more informal approach, but just as critical, peer-to-peer support among teachers. And this is really about building a professional learning community inside a school. Anthony was talking about multi-day trainings, but then also regional coaching, PLC kinds of monthly meetings among clusters of schools. And you can see from the different responses that all of these different kinds of approaches are likely very contextualized, set in the context within which they're working. In order to get access to teachers, it's really critical that we work within the realistic existing setting for those teachers. I also worked, Anthony, in an area where we did regional monthly meetings for clusters of schools as opposed to sending coaches out to schools. So we also have an approach that goes straight to the grassroots level down to professional learning communities. You will see a response on here about many projects not being able to get schools and teachers access to formal training, and really choosing to kind of take the existing resources down to the grassroots level and build from the bottom up. Yet another example of keeping it within context. So some challenges coming up. Helping teachers build confidence. You know, we can look at the elements of reading, and when we are provided with good information on those, it's relatively easy to understand. We can even provide teachers with really good scripted or model lessons. We can provide them with even videotape examples of teachers using strategies. But building teachers' confidence to take the risk to try something new really is critical, because while we're changing practice and we want to change results, what we're really attempting to do in continuous professional development is to change people's point of view, their perspective on their role, what constitutes success in their role, and what they should be doing in the classroom in terms of new attempts, in terms of continuous assessment, and that ability to respond to the specific children who are in the classroom. Bart has brought up a really excellent topic, getting private universities involved in ministry-supported teacher training. This is Bart, making sure that the private universities who are actually preparing a large bulk of teachers are engaged at the national level with public institutions, and preparing all teachers using a common kind of process, getting a common kind of message, and building a fairly common approach. With national standards, national scope and sequence and materials, and national accountability systems, it's critical that teachers have relatively common approaches to their core method of instruction. And Diane, hi Diane. Diane notes it's not only the confidence of teachers, but when you put a teacher into a peer coaching position, asking them to guide other teachers in the building, getting them to be confident in their taking on their role with that, and then the confidence of their teachers to look to them as a peer leader can also be a challenge. So there's lots of things that are challenging, and honestly, to note these challenges and discuss them. I'm going to move us forward into section 1, looking at the modalities and characteristics of effective continuous professional development. So one of the first things to look at is who needs to be engaged in continuous professional development. And the point of view on this has really morphed and grown over time. Of course, many programs begin with the teacher who is the direct frontline access to children to make change in student learning. Clearly needs continuous professional development, but also because there is such a great emphasis now on capacity building, release to independence, and sustainable national programs, it's critical from the beginning of our program work to bring government officials at the national and even regional and district levels in for training as well. There's a number of other people there, people responsible for different components of the program, school administrators, school instructional leaders, coaches, and Bart referenced pre-service teacher educators, as well as school management committees and community members. So this really stretches across the gamut of all of the stakeholders who have an influence on and a stake in what happens in the classroom. Now, these folks don't necessarily all need the same breadth or depth of training, and in fact, sometimes not even the same content. Teachers, of course, in the classroom need very deep knowledge, practice, and support around the classroom instructional program. Government officials need to understand those programs, and if they are trainers, they need to have deep knowledge. But if they are doing things like managing programs or working to support and structure access or resources or leadership positions, they need a different kind of subset of training as well around those issues of how to build your own capacity to manage and maintain programs over time, how to monitor and evaluate what's going on at schools. For school administrators as well, they have to be able to recognize whether what's happening in the classroom is what it should be, but they also have to be able to manage the process of all of the different kinds of components that may exist inside a school-based literacy initiative. So lots of people in need of continuous professional development. So how do we know what's effective? Well, we can see from your responses to the initial chat that different approaches are used in different contexts, and that's exactly the way we should be looking at it and thinking about it. No one modality works for all learning outcomes or for all learners or in all kinds of contexts as well. But there are some common things that will support you in effective professional development. Take a look at the bullets there on the screen in a moment.
I'm going to move us to the next slide where we summarize the modalities of continuous professional development. You've mentioned many of these, I think, already in your chats we had earlier, but we wanted to summarize them, and then throughout the presentation, we're going to be discussing what these look like in the context of early grade reading programs, what we have found to be some good practices, and we'll share some resources with you as well so you can look at what others are doing. And I should make a plug here to say we would love to get and see your training and professional development materials. We try very hard at the Global Reading Network to source resources of interest from programs, but they can often be difficult to find, in particular the training resources, the professional development resources. So if you have some and they would be good examples, we are more than happy to include them as references in webinars and to also post them to our website if you'd be interested in that. So while maybe Amy is hopefully getting her internet connection speeded up a little bit, I'll just summarize these quickly. Formal training is the most traditional approach to continuous professional development, right? We're all familiar with this kind of workshop setting where people come together and they all learn the same content, more or less presented in the same way. If you're doing it, you know, throughout a whole country, everyone's in their regions, hopefully doing something similar. So it's usually formed as kind of the basis to get information out to everybody, and then it might be supported by follow-on trainings, also workshops or coaching midway through the year to provide opportunities for in-depth learning once teachers or others have had time, you know, to implement what the new approach is or the new program is. On-site support, often referred to as coaching or pedagogical coaching, sometimes mentoring. Both teachers, principals, and education leaders can benefit from coaching. We tend to think of it in the early grade reading context as really geared towards teachers, which is true, but certainly other actors can benefit from some form of coaching. This modality of CPD is an ongoing process that supports teachers or others in improving their practices, usually provided by a trained coach and takes place at the school on a periodic basis. A coach typically observes teachers or other individuals, you know, in their day-to-day routines, provides specific feedback to them, and can develop a plan for improvement. As I mentioned before, other actors can benefit, like school principals might benefit from a visit by somebody from a district or regional level whose focus is more on, again, coaching and not necessarily inspecting or supervising to help understand the challenges that they're encountering and find solutions. I mentioned this is usually face-to-face type of coaching, but we'll talk a little bit later about some efforts to also do distance coaching or virtual coaching, with South Africa is currently experimenting with and evaluating. Another modality of continuous professional development is learning communities. Sometimes these are called professional learning communities. They go by different names. They can range from informal or formal, and they can include teachers, principals, or coaches themselves as a learning community to get together to share experiences and learn from each other. Teachers might engage in peer-to-peer learning, where one teacher observes the other. They might get together in small groups, sometimes with a knowledgeable facilitator to learn and share experiences. And they've been found in the research to increase teachers' ability to implement new practices and improve student outcomes. What's really useful about these learning communities is that they provide kind of a social setting in a very natural context for the participants, like right at the school, you know, in the language that they're familiar with, you know, in the environment that they know really well. So it can be a very cost-effective way of providing continuous professional development if implemented well. And lastly, self-guided reflection and study. This is much less common in early grade reading programs, but we wanted to include it as a modality because it certainly, you know, is something that happens in many contexts, and it might be something to think about and consider in early grade reading programs, as many of them have been, you know, implemented for many years. And we might think about, is there a way to provide some targeted continuous professional development to different actors, not necessarily everyone even, through self-study materials where the teacher, you know, or another actor does independent work, either through, print materials that are provided, through some kind of online learning opportunity to engage in self-reflection or, take a deep dive into certain subject matter. So I'm going to turn it now back over to Amy.
So when we look at the content of CPD, the content for teachers, as I noted, can be in some ways similar to the content for other education actors, but there's some differences as well. And I'm going to let you take a look at the 2 columns of bullets here showing the different kinds of things that you want to focus on when you work with different groups of stakeholders. It's most important in terms of determining the content of training for you to have a really clear layout of who's responsible for what in programs, a clear vision of the goals, a clear vision of the objectives, and different roles and assignments that people carry. 1, because it's efficient, but 2, it also allows you to really target your training and to build a very cohesive program approach where it's clear to everyone precisely what needs to be done. When you have clearly defined roles, it also allows you to go deeper in terms of knowledge and skills development with the different actors, and it encourages them to link together and work together, which reinforces that sense of professional learning community at the school and even district, regional, or even at the national ministry level. So we're going to go back into an activity now around the modalities of continuous professional development again. What types of modalities have you found to be most effective in supporting long-term instructional improvement? Is it training? Is it coaching? We had a little bit of discussion, kind of people laying out the different approaches they've seen, but now we're looking at what do you think would be most effective in supporting long-term instructional improvement? And how did you in any of your work identify the appropriate mix that would be effective in terms of the context in which you worked? So for those of you who shared earlier, these were the different kinds of approaches you'd seen used. Can you let us know, based on your experience, what do you think would be the most effective mix or the most effective approach in the context in which you work, and why? How did you come to those conclusions? Okay, Anthony is our first to share in the context of Haiti, looking at external regional coaches. The struggle for Anthony's team was getting school leaders to take on more significant coaching role. This can be a difficult process, and it really depends on the existing level of responsibility and type of responsibility that school leaders have. Also, in the particular context, the way in which they are traditionally viewed in the setting. In many settings, school leaders are viewed as managers, less as instructional leaders, and getting that to shift both from a policy point of view and actual practice point of view can be quite difficult. But it seems that Anthony found in the context of Haiti that the regional meetings were helpful and effective in getting around the kinds of problems they were having with coaching happening at the school level. And Corey, hi Corey. Corey makes a key point. It really does completely depend upon the context. Teacher time, access, physical access to people in the building, the funding support as well, the kinds of resources that are available, transport. And then I think she makes a critical point also of working within existing structures. You know, we can expend a lot of effort and even a lot of finances to provide short-term external support. And sometimes that's necessary. But if that short-term external support doesn't work to build the capacity of the existing kinds of potential support structures that are within the system, then the long-term viability of that kind of approach is going to be very limited. Working in coaching as teachers, and I think it's what Diane was focused on as well, the idea that the kinds of training we provide to teachers doesn't really come to life until they try to implement new ideas and new strategies in the classroom. And that's the point where it's very critical that the process begins to circle on itself bringing teachers together to actually talk out what it is they've been trying to do, put their struggles on the table, learn from one another. This is where the classroom programs really begin to live. Teachers gain their confidence, which people were talking about earlier being an issue, and can look for more sustainability of programs in the classroom. So just an overview of training. When we talk about training, training allows us to get out to a wide range of teachers or any other participants a foundation of common knowledge and skills. So we want to make sure that the basic foundational training is there. That's basic foundational skills and knowledge are there, and that's best done through face-to-face training or even online training, but formalized interaction using a formal common set of materials. It also allows us to make sure that people who are receiving the training get the same kind of instruction on how to implement programs with fidelity. This issue of fidelity is important for a couple of reasons. One reason, of course, because we want to make sure that we know what everyone is doing and that everyone is doing what they should be doing. But also in terms of measuring program impact, we have to really look at the issue of fidelity of implementation, where we can't actually know what it is that we're measuring. And we can't actually know whether the results that we're seeing or not seeing are related to the programs that we've been implementing. So it doesn't provide us, when we have implementation that's not fidelitous on a large scale, it doesn't provide us with the kind of information we need to know how to make program recommendations. And when training is done well, it also allows us to really show teachers how teaching should be done, modeling in teacher training with them the same kinds of approaches, collaborative work strategies, small group, whole group, individual reflection that should be happening in the classroom as well. So when we look at the characteristics of high quality training, you can see them on the screen. One is that it needs to be needs specific. So we can't simply bring in a package training into a new context and implement it thinking everyone always needs to know the same basic information or they need to know the same kinds of skills. We have to really target it, which helps us be efficient. It helps us meet the needs of those learners more specifically so that they feel invested in the process. They feel that they're known as well. So this does require some level of evidence gathering prior to planning or designing training to make sure that we are really focused on the kinds of needs of the people who will be participating. It also needs to be practical. If it is purely conceptual, then it doesn't put those participants in the position to be able to know what to do and to go straight out into their context and get to work with the new skills and ideas we have given them. As we noted earlier, it should be hands-on. People should be active in their learning, context appropriate, meaning we're not bringing in training that doesn't fit within the realistic context where people are working. Also iterative. One-shot training just doesn't do it. And one-shot training, even followed up by coaching, sometimes doesn't do it. A mix of formal and informal, localized and generalized kinds of approaches are what are critical. We have some handouts that go with this issue of characteristics of high-quality training. Those are handouts 2, which talks about materials to support professional development. Handout 3, which is a handout of resources for professional development. And then handout 4, which I particularly really like, which is training tips and activities for professional development as well. So while we're not going to go through those in the session today, I do encourage you to take a look at them after the webinar has ended today.
Amy, do you want to perhaps address a question that might be good to catch here? Samantha asked if there's any tension between need-based, need-specific and context-specific training and this issue of the importance of fidelity of implementation.
I think there can be a tension between it, and I think we have to make some choices. And particularly if a program focuses on continuous professional development and not just training, the tension reduces somewhat and the choices become easier. We really have to survey the larger community within which we're doing training to look at, initially for training, those common needs that exist on a broad basis. So really focusing that initial training on what are those areas of need that most participants really have an urgent need. So for example, if we're talking about teachers at particular grade levels or teachers in particular regions, we can follow up with more specific drilled down coaching and mentoring information. We can provide additional print material. Also, when we move from initial training into, say, kind of a refresher or that iterative second round or third round of training, we can begin to either cluster people by specific need, let them self-select into particular modules of training. So there's a variety of ways to address that tension. But initially, I would always recommend that we do a broad-based survey of our larger learning community, look at those common needs that are threads across the community and address those things first. Get people started and then begin to drill down in a variety of formal and informal ways.
Yeah, and if I may add on, Samantha, I think what Amy was also referring to about fidelity of implementation was of the actual program in terms of getting everyone on the same page that they need to be using a teacher's guide, for example, or there's certain learner materials that need to be used in certain ways. And so the need specific issues relate to the training, whereas getting people to actually implement the program as it was intended to be, which we find doesn't always happen, is where that common training can be useful.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Allison. So a couple of examples to talk about with training. A newer example, when we look at what's happening in Read 2 in Ethiopia, training for teachers in Read 2 in Ethiopia has been underway for about 1.5 years. And there are 2 levels of specific training for teachers. There's training at grades 1 through 4, which is focused on basic skills development for children in reading and writing. There's also training at grades 5 through 8, which focuses on applying literacy in service of content learning. And though this is provided in a cascade model, the training is structured such that it ensures that it's actually the participant materials that carry the necessary expertise, the common messages that lead to those fidelitous kinds of practice, instead of relying on the training facilitators at different levels to have a similar level of expertise in the content. In addition, the training is also then being supported by 2 tiers of coaching that follows on, which also works inside an existing government structure. It's not an add-on, it's not additional external resources. So it adds 0 cost to the regular continuous professional development program. But it also uses materials that carry the expertise and the message. So trainers and coaches in this context in Ethiopia serve as facilitators of process more so than they serve as literacy experts. And that's been one way that they have found to get a common message out to teachers, make sure everybody understands the same information, and at least move teachers forward in that first phase of their work in Read 2. Another example that's quite different is in Nigeria. So when we talk about the NEI Plus program, NEI Plus actually developed and delivered graduate coursework for teacher educators, researchers, and people at the national level to build their own expertise in terms of designing, delivering, monitoring, and assessing programs. So this is going at a large-scale program approach, focusing in a very intensive way on building the skills of the existing internal leadership structure in the country to be able to carry out program implementation on their own. There is a handout that supports more information on this. It's handout 5, which is a sample course syllabus and a description of how the initiative was done. And since they have graduated those participants, the participants have also been trained in delivering community outreach and early grades reading, support for parents, and support for improved school attendance. And they've been doing this for a few months now, since May of 2019. They've been on their own and implementing those things that they learned in that graduate level coursework. So a couple of different examples for different ways to approach training. So I'm going to move us now into coaching, and I'll do a brief overview of coaching with an activity, and then I'll be turning you over to Allison for a bit. So one of the things we're all aware of if we work in this work for any period of time is that teachers can't make the changes they need to make without some support on site in their school as they work and attempt new practices. Continuous feedback from a coach, regular feedback, it helps all teachers. It's not just new teachers, but all teachers to continue to improve, be empowered in their practice, and to feel invigorated and energized in the classroom as well. Coaching can also support a system level or program level monitoring effort as well. So not only does it provide those ongoing supports for teachers, but it also gives us an opportunity to pull information back out of the system to help us continue to improve the kinds of resources, information, and training that we provide to those people who are implementing at the grassroots level. And of course, as we've referenced multiple times, it creates a more professional learning environment in the school for all of the adults. And creation of that learning environment is one of the keys to long-term sustainability of program work in a building. So when we try to make the case for coaching, there is a set of research from high-income contexts that has, for a very long time, supported coaching. And you'll see the information here about that research on the screen. It's been a meta-analysis of 44 studies of different kinds of coaching programs. These programs are from inside the US. And in early grades, pre-K and primary literacy, they found that coaching actually is a very effective means of improving teachers' instructional practices, as well as having an impact on student academic outcomes. However, the evidence from developing contexts or low-income country contexts is limited, but it is growing. So there's data here from studies in South Africa and also Kenya coming out of low-income country context. In South Africa, they found that coaching as a part of a structured learning program was more cost-effective in increasing students' reading than training alone. So more impact for your funding by providing coaching. It boosted students' reading comprehension skills at a higher level. And in Kenya, they also found that coaching improves literacy outcomes in both public school settings, but also in non-formal education settings. And those non-formal education settings, we don't talk about probably as much as we should. But we all know there is a need for continued study around coaching and mentoring in low and middle income country contexts. And GRN actually has produced a document on coaching that talks about the kinds of research that is needed for that as well. So when we look at the characteristics of high quality coaching, there's a lot of different characteristics, but 4 of the most critical are here. It needs to be practical. It should not be academic. It should be focused on using what it is that teachers are doing in the classroom, pulling those practical problems up out of their classroom experience and responding to those in a very timely and practical manner. Should be needs-based and also focused on the self-identified needs of the teachers. So once we have implementation happening in the classroom, bringing teachers together in coaching settings where they bring their work, they bring their process, they bring their issues to the table, and those things form the foundation of the content of what happens in coaching. Most practical for teachers. Should be collaborative. And this means that the coach in any setting should not be positioned as an outsider. Sometimes the coach is external. That doesn't matter. The coach should always be viewed as a peer and a mentor, an expert peer and mentor, but as a peer and a mentor, non-judgmental, non-threatening. And you'll see that in the next next row on this graphic as well. And then activities should be co-constructed, which links back up to needs-based and self-identified. So not only should teachers bring their own learning needs, but they should, as much as possible, participate with the coach in co-constructing how things will happen in coaching as much as possible. And as I noted, a non-judgmental environment. Sometimes, in some contexts, coaches carry multiple hats. And if those coaches are also in something of a supervisory role, whether that is technical or whether it is practical, it's very difficult for teachers and for coaches to shift their thinking about those roles and hats. So it's very important for a coach, no matter their ongoing role, to not bring an evaluator's hat to the process, not to judge the quality of teachers' instruction. Instead, gather evidence with the core question in mind: how do I help this teacher move to the next approach? And learning how to gently and carefully move to the level that we can provide constructive criticism, and then support those teachers who are willing to take that criticism and move forward to take the risk and try something new. Also, accountable. Now, when we say, well, you know, coaching is practical and it's collaborative, we do it together, it's gentle and it's non-judgmental, but it also must be accountable. There should be things in place to motivate people to participate. There should be systems in a school to monitor the extent to which coaching is making a difference, gathering data from those participants about how it's working for them and what they need, and even looking at the ways in which practice changes due to coaching and due to the kinds of interactions that they have in coaching. Not just that accountability for participation, but accountability for using what it is that they're learning in the coaching setting as well. So you'll note that earlier we talked about training, we talked about coaching, we also talked briefly about learning communities. And we're not going to be focusing a lot today on learning communities, but there is also a move now, particularly in looking at how to release systems to their own independent process of kind of merging this process of coaches and learning communities together. So beginning even potentially with external coaching or building the skills of internal coaches, starting formally and moving to the more informal direction where those coaching meetings and those coaching interactions become more like learning communities that are less formal, that are more self-directed, and that are more sustainable in terms of developing the professional community, the sense of teachers of being empowered to impact and having the advocacy to impact their own practice and to create their own solutions to the kinds of challenges. And a couple of places we know where this is taking place are in Ghana and also in Nigeria. So Allison referenced earlier the idea of technology to support continuous professional development. And we know we need to have high quality materials in order to support it. And many people are using more and more technology to support continuous professional development in terms of financial efficiency, but also in terms of building larger networks of coaches, teachers, and experts across bigger areas. And you'll see several different examples here using mobile phones to support app-based content delivery or SMS interactive systems, using tablets that include lesson plans or even an app like Papaya with letter sounds, videos, assessment tools for teachers, and particularly relevant to this conversation as well is the use of tablets by coaches to support their classroom observations, to have resources readily available, but also to share information about what's happening in schools up through the system so that it can be used for decision-making for next step. Interactive video conferencing workshops, and then even self-paced e-coursework as well. Taking face-to-face or multifaceted programs, turning them into self-guided, self-paced e-coursework as well. So there is some research on this, and the research does show that technology is not always the most cost-effective solution. But again, just like a training and coaching balance, what works best is what works in the context. For who it's for, the most cost-effective, and it's all about the context within which you're working. Some programs choose to provide technology on a broader basis. Some programs choose to provide technology only for coaches who are working in the building. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. In webinar 3, we did address this issue of technology, and so there is a resource and references list on technology from webinar 3, which you can find on the website after the session today, that can give you some more information. So when we look at the considerations that we need to keep in mind when we design CPD, because we clearly know, in looking at all of the different information, that context is king, and we need to make sure that even if we are bringing in some existing kinds of basic program models and approaches, we need to customize and do some designing from the outset. So the first thing, of course, is to identify that the goals for CPD, and that they're aligned with policies, and that they're aligned with the initiative. We also need to look at who needs CPD and what kind of CPD they need, how to best access them, how to know what it is they need, their knowledge and skills, who within the system can work as a facilitator for CPD, or who can be supported and have their capacity built to the point where they can work as a facilitator, potentially with external partners initially, and then released gradually to independent facilitation and leadership. And then really looking from the front of the program at the kinds of factors that impact the potential sustainability of your approach, including the extent to which the existing system has the capacity to continue to do what it is you're planning, the feasibility of that in the context, and of course the cost for long-term implementation. Making sure pre-service and in-service are aligned together, and Bart referenced this in a comment earlier in a chat about working with pre-service institutions and making sure they're on board with the process. And unfortunately, in many cases, they seem to be on the fringes in lots of programs, which of course continues to keep us in an in-service modality. As long as we do not change pre-service practices and pre-service content, then we are continuing to have to come back and do in-service to add in and fill the gaps of what is missing. And then, of course, assess and evaluate the approach that you use at different steps along the way, asking questions all the time. Has this really been the appropriate mix and the appropriate approach for the appropriate people? What have we learned, and how do we need to revise this as we move forward? And there's a handout to go with this slide, which is handout 6, activities and considerations for planning and implementing, that I think you could find of help to you if you're in the process of designing, or even if you're in the process of reflecting on how it is you have done your design previously. So we're going to move into another activity that's around planning, and particularly planning for sustainable continuous professional development, using the chat window today. And you can see the guiding questions that are here. We're going to ask you to share your own experience designing continuous professional development to support expansion of your program and sustainability of your program. And so this really gets at, how did you draw on existing structures and staff? How did you prepare key actors to sustain the work beyond your externally supported program? How did you work with government to prepare for sustained continuous professional development beyond the life of a project? So as you reflect on your work, what are the ways in which inside any program you've worked on, did you intentionally take key efforts to make sure those people who would be sustaining the work over the long run were really prepared to do that work? And any ways in which you looked at some existing staff inside the system and help to work to reshape their roles so that it could do better service long-term for continuous professional development. I'm going to pass you all off to Allison now for section 2 of the session, which focuses on a spotlight on coaching.
Thank you so much, Amy. I just advanced one more slide here that we have on all the references that were mentioned and resources, so you can take a look at handout 7 at your leisure. And if you'd like to access some of these resources or references, all the links and information is there. So section 2, the second half of this webinar, we're going to focus on coaching. As many of you noted at the beginning, you're engaged in efforts to provide coaching support to teachers in your program. But we've heard a lot from people that we need to really understand what's happening in these coaching programs, and we need to improve in many cases upon what we're doing. So we're going to do a spotlight on coaching. Amy already gave a nice summary of that, but I just wanted to summarize a few key points to set the stage for our more in-depth discussion. We know it's a common component of early grade reading improvement efforts, and that's a great thing as we all move towards enhancing programs and providing more comprehensive approaches to CPD. We know it's focused on getting teachers to adapt practices that are usually quite new in our context, and I think it's always good to step back and to really understand that in most of the cases where early grade reading programs are being implemented, teachers didn't receive any preparation prior to our programs in terms of how to teach reading, how to teach language. And so with these one-off trainings that we've talked about are never sufficient, and I think Amy underscored that point. We also know that there's a great variety of coaching approaches and activities, and while this adheres to the principle that we should make our professional development context specific, it also means that we sort of can't always compare outcomes, and we maybe need to take a deeper dive into understanding what those similarities and differences are and when certain approaches may be more beneficial than others in different contexts. We know there's a lot of challenges in providing, and I would also say managing, coaching and coaches. The quality of coaching is something that's still kind of a big black box. We don't necessarily have good measures for it, and we're not necessarily reporting on it as much as we probably should be at this stage of early grade reading program implementation. So we'll be looking more at monitoring and evaluation. I'm going to show now, Stephanie's going to help me to show a video of coaching, just a couple minutes to maybe have a nice wake us all up here as we move into the second hour of a webinar, and show you what coaching looks like in the context of Northern Nigeria.
Don fara lura, SSO zai zauna a wani keɓantaccen wuri a cikin aji daga baya, inda zai rika lura da yadda malami yake gabatar da cikakken darasin karatun Hausa. Yayin da SSO yake lura da darasin, zai rika bin jerin bayanan jagora na lura da darasin aji don tabbatar da ko malamin yana koyar da muhimman abubuwan darasin. Jami'in zai lura ko malamin yana bin jagoran malamai yadda ya kamata da amfani da littafin karatun ɗalibai da kuma littafin karatun a bayyane kamar yadda ya kamata. Bayan SSO ya lura da darasin da aka gabatar, zai shigar da bayanan da ya tara a wata na'ura mai kwakwalwa ta hannu, wato tablet. Ita wannan na'urar za ta takaice wa SSO sassan darasi da zai mai da hankali yayin zantawar da ya yi da malamin bayan darasi. Daga bisani Rara ta yi nazarin bayanan da aka tara don tantance ci gaban da malamai suka samu da kuma gano ɓangarorin da za a ƙara ba da tallafi a lokutan horarwa da tarurrukan gamayya.
Wancan karan zan fara daga nan, 1, 2.
Da zarar SSO ya kammala aikin lura da darasin Hausa, zai zaɓi ɗalibai 4 ta hanyar canke don gudanar da ƙwarya-ƙwaryen gwajin iya karatu.
Aboki na zo.
Manufar shi wannan gwajin ita ce don a fahimci matakin iya karatun ɗalibai, don tattauna ci gaban da suka samu da malami, sannan kuma don gano sassan da ɗaliban ke buƙatar ƙarin tallafi. Ƙwarya-ƙwarya gwajin kan auna matakan ƙwarewar ɗalibai a karatu da suka haɗa da sanin sautukan haruffa da gano gabar kalma da gina kalma da kuma karatun jimla. SSO ya shirya wa zantawar da zai yi da malamin daga lokacin da ya gama lura da darasin da malamin ya gudanar da yin ƙwarya-ƙwaryen gwajin iya karatun ɗalibai. Yayin wannan zaman zantawar, SSO zai tattauna abubuwan da ya lura tare da malami. Yana kwatantawa da martanin da aka samu daga na'urar lantarkin da kuma abubuwan da ya lura ko ta lura.
Amma kan mace ka nuna motsin jikinsa na kama.
Wasu lokutan SSO zai kwatanta tare da nuna wa malami ɓangarorin aiwatar da darasi da ya lura da su da suke buƙatar ingantawa. Babban abin da ke kan gaba a aikin rara shine samar da yanayi ga malamai don su yi nazari kuma su ba da gudunmawa a ci gaban ƙwarewa aikinsu. Saboda haka, jami'an SSO suna ƙarfafa gwiwar malamai yayin taron da su don bayyana abubuwa da su kansu suka lura da su game da koyarwarsu da kuma yadda yara ke koyo, waɗanda suka haɗa da nasarori da ƙalubalen da suke fuskanta. A ƙarshen taron bayan lura da darasi, SSO da malamai za su gano ɓangarorin da ke buƙatar ingantawa da kuma yadda za a inganta su. Ana ƙarfafa gwiwar malamai su ajiye kundin waiwaye na mako-mako kan koyarwarsu. Manufar wannan kundin wanda ya kunshi tsokaci don yin nuni ga nazarin malam.
In full disclosure, I was involved with this program, but I think the video just shows you what a number of programs are doing in terms of coaches visiting teachers, often doing student assessment of some kind, and providing feedback to coaches. And as we'll talk about, many of them are using technology. But I will say there were many things you saw in this video about this approach that were shown to not work particularly well. And so this issue of monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation of what's being done, because this is a pilot effort, is really, really important. So let me just reiterate something Amy said. This part of the presentation really draws heavily on this resource that the Global Reading Network and REACH collaborated on, called Coaching in Early Grade Reading Programs, Evidence, Experiences, and Recommendations. It's a summary, an expanded version of what we will talk about today, and I've heard from a few people that it's been helpful in staff professional development, and reviewing what programs are doing, kind of checklists and learning questions that you might want to go through as a program to understand if you know what's happening in your program, or if there's other things that you could be doing to get some answers on these key questions about coaching. So if you haven't downloaded it, please do that sometime if you're interested more in this topic. So what we're going to talk about today, these 6 issues, more or less: coach roles and responsibilities, the knowledge and skills that we know that coaches need to have to be effective. We're going to talk more about coach recruitment and where do the coaches come from that we are collaborating with in different countries, and what are the advantages and sometimes the disadvantages that we need to acknowledge around who serves as coaches. What is effective in terms of coach preparation and support, and the materials that they use, which includes technology in many cases. And we're going to explore the budding research findings on frequency and duration of coaching, and what we understand to affect the quality of coaching and eventually the outcomes in terms of improved teacher instruction and student outcomes. So before I dive in, I wanted to hear a little bit more from everyone about your experiences with coaching. A couple of you have already shared that, but if you can, reflect maybe more deeply on those issues that I just mentioned that we're going to be talking about, to talk about what have you found to be most successful with respect to your coaching approach, whether it's been the things that coaches do in the classroom to the training that you've offered coaches. What have you found to be the most challenging? And if you've been able to meet some of those challenges, what were your strategies? And if not, what are some of those burning issues that you want to make sure that we hopefully provide you with some guidance on? So Elizabeth talks about coach serving as a coach and having to translate, have a translator to facilitate the communication. Certainly that would be challenging. And one important thing we've talked about in past webinars is language, and how we really want teachers to speak the same language as students. And I think we could say the same in terms of best practices for coaches and the teachers, that it really helps facilitate communication and build trust if they speak a common language. Ideally, they come from the same area and same culture. Because as I will be talking about later, trust is a really, really important factor to have a productive, effective coach-teacher relationship. So what do early grade reading coaches do? The primary role of a coach is to provide ongoing professional development and support to teachers to help them improve their classroom instruction. Kind of full stop on that. Like, their reason to be and be in the school is to really help a teacher in their specific environment to improve their instruction. And of course, the ultimate goal that we want is for that to lead to students learning better. The role of a coach is different from that of a supervisor or an inspector, though at times and in some contexts there may be some overlap. For example, a coach and supervisor might both have to check whether a school director is present, verify whether a teacher has the day's lesson plan, etc. But it's really important to make a distinction between how and why these activities are conducted depending on a person's role during that school visit, because the purpose of the coach's visit is to understand teachers' needs, to provide them with individualized support. And because we know that supervisors are sometimes identified to serve as coaches, while at the same time they do retain that position of authority as an inspector or supervisor, we really need to make that as clear as possible as we can in our programs where there may be that overlap, and we'll talk more about that around the coach recruitment and training section. Evidence from both high and low income contexts indicates the importance of focusing the coach's role on supporting teachers as opposed to any kind of administrative duties. A longitudinal study on coaching conducted as part of a large-scale reading reform effort in the U.S. found that teachers were more likely to change their practices in the classroom when they received that information from a coach rather than from administrators or supervisors. So again, fostering that relationship is really important. Research also suggests that one-to-one coaching is a significant predictor of student learning, and that coach responsibilities like observation, co-teaching, modeling, feedback, and relationship building can positively influence teacher practice. And we do have some research too on group coaching, that it can be an efficient and effective way to support multiple teachers at the same time, kind of that overlap with the professional learning circles that we talked about, having some kind of facilitation from a coach can be. So we reviewed a lot of the early grade reading program coaching initiatives in low and middle income countries. We found that the primary role of coaches has been to monitor teachers' instruction. This has often come in the form of monitoring the fidelity of implementation, so some overlap with a monitoring role, to provide feedback to the teachers to improve their practices. So they visit the coaches on a set schedule. Ideally, they record information about what the teachers are doing using some kind of standardized instrument usually, and then they provide feedback. So these experiences suggest that in some contexts, the coaches have struggled to perform their roles and responsibilities as expected by the program, particularly when they're in the early stages of implementation. That's because in these contexts, as many of you listening know, there's never been such a thing as a pedagogical coach. Maybe there is somebody in the system who is supposed to have this role but isn't necessarily carrying it out, and certainly not to support teachers in early grade reading improvement. So some of these factors that are influencing coaches' ability to really take on this role and responsibility is lack of understanding about their role. This is, again, new. They don't necessarily know how to reorient themselves from what they've been doing within the system to being a coach. Certainly the capacity of individuals is a big challenge, especially with relation to their knowledge of early grade reading. Contextual factors like distance to school, road conditions, lack of sort of infrastructure support, and also lack of commitment that, while in many cases we're hearing great success stories about coaches who have really embraced their role, we also know that a lot of individuals have not. Maybe they were trained to take on a certain role, or they assumed their position, after 10, 20 years of working in the system, and they're not necessarily inclined to suddenly become a coach. They didn't necessarily choose that as a vocation. So there's not always that commitment and motivation to suddenly become a coach. And I think we have to really recognize that that is something that, we ourselves, if someone just told us one day to really take on a new role and responsibility that is not easy, that we also might struggle to carry it out well. So some recommendations and considerations that we outline in the coaching resource is to really consider coach abilities and assign them responsibilities accordingly, and to codify those in some kind of written description of coach roles and responsibilities. Wherever you can, to build that into the job description of the position that those individuals have within the system. So it's something that supports accountability as well, that we can say, this really is part of your job to provide this kind of support to teachers. Certainly on the, to the extent possible, to identifying some of these challenges in advance of implementing a coaching program. We don't always have the luxury now, we're already implementing them, but as we find out more and more what the challenges are, to be willing to adapt and say, the way we've structured this isn't necessarily working, how do we make it work better? So what knowledge and skills do coaches have need to be effective? In more well-resourced contexts, coaches are usually required to obtain specific academic credentials, as well as to have a certain level of experience as teachers, and specifically as early grade reading teachers. But in the context we're working in, we know those opportunities haven't existed. There haven't been specialties in coaching or early grade reading instruction that the individuals tapped to serve as coaches might have an opportunity, have had an opportunity in the past to acquire. We heard about that experience in Nigeria now, where there is a graduate level certificate available, which is great. And I hope if anyone has similar activities that they've been involved with, that you share those. But researchers and practitioners commonly agree that there is a specific set of knowledge and skills that are essential for coaches to do their job. These are listed on the slide here. I'm going to underscore something I mentioned earlier about this issue of trust and confidentiality. We know there's these sort of core academic type skills that we know they have to have around teaching and early grade reading pedagogy. But trust and confidentiality, the ability to engage in critical feedback and to have strong interpersonal communication skills is really, really important. Rita Bean, in her an earlier work on coaching and early grade reading programs, talked about this need for a disposition suitable for coaching. And I like that phrase because I think it speaks to this idea that coaches need to be willing to learn. They need to be sort of have that openness to talking and discussing with teachers. So time needs to be spent preparing coaches for to have these soft skills. That includes, role modeling with them, how they go about these visits and providing feedback to teachers, how they build trust, giving them, that visit protocol that makes sure it includes time to ask teachers questions and to hear from teachers, which you'll find doesn't always happen if they're used to a different role. Understanding how cultural dynamics or other issues might influence how coaches and teachers view each other and interact also need to be addressed. So coach recruitment is a big issue in early grade reading programs. In contexts where these programs are new and the concept of instructional coach is not well established, the personnel with the knowledge, skills, and experiences that I just talked about don't normally exist. So programs find themselves either needing to recruit coaches from outside the system or work to reorient and provide professional development to existing education sector personnel. So the first option of hiring people from outside the system has been done. It's been utilized in different efforts. I think primarily in conflict-affected countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone, where there was just such a massive shortage of personnel. In Liberia, they're trying, I think, to transition to having coaches be from within the system, but that's really difficult, of course, when your system is constrained for so many reasons. So while it might be a necessity in some cases, or it might be something that's tried for piloting purposes, just in terms of trying to understand the approach and activities and the effectiveness of them, the second option that's more common across early grade reading programs is identifying existing personnel within the system who have some mandate, hopefully, to provide support to teachers and to visit schools. So several programs, you just saw the example from Nigeria, and I see there's some colleagues from Nigeria who can share with you some more firsthand recent experiences of using school support officers to serve as coaches. In Kenya, they use community support officers, which are existing system personnel. In Senegal, as part of the All Children Reading program there, they use government school inspectors, but they're also exploring using school-based personnel like school directors, and we'll talk a bit about that hybrid approach in just a little bit. One newer research finding from the low-income country context is from Nigeria, where we found that coaches' prior experience in a supervisory role was somewhat negatively associated with the quality of their coaching, but when you interacted that experience with the coach's experience as a teacher, that there was a positive association with improvement in teachers' practices. So I think this also speaks to this issue of if we have some kinds of choices, perhaps within the pool of candidates, that we do look for people with some kind of teaching background. And I think that's fairly intuitive, right? That if someone's going to serve as a coach, if they have actually been in a classroom teaching, that they may be more able to understand the teacher's perspective and to connect with them more than someone who has never spent time in a classroom. Handout 8 is a case study from the Senegal program I mentioned that talks about where they're recruiting coaches from and how they're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of who serves as coaches. As we find that more and more it's not necessarily a one-person-fits-all approach to coaching, that various USAID programs are now trying kind of a hybrid approach, or using coaches from schools to meet the needs of teachers. So in Madagascar, they recently evaluated a pilot where school directors served as coaches. Again, I think this was due to constraints with district or non-school-based personnel not being sufficient, or the funds not being there in a sustainable way that they could expect that would happen beyond the life of a project. But school directors who were already there were tapped to serve as coaches. And they came away with some interesting findings related to kind of motivation, that a lot of teachers expressed an interest in being peer coaches. And so as this program, I think, is being expanded, they're going to explore how they could possibly use school directors and peer teachers to support coaching in schools. In Ghana, they're currently evaluating the effectiveness of using school-based head teachers who are principals and curriculum lead teachers to be supported by district-based support teachers. So recognizing, especially at the scale that Ghana is already implementing, that it's unrealistic to expect people from outside the school to have the time and transportation support to constantly be visiting schools, but to tap the existing personnel at schools, but to then be supported by district staff who sometimes might also provide that extra coaching support. I just mentioned the Senegal case study, where they're also using this hybrid approach of school directors, but realizing that not all school directors might be able to do that or might need coaching support themselves. They're using district type level coaches to coach them. So these are, all, as we try new things, we learn new things, and so it'll be interesting to see what these programs find out, and if any of you are also trying these kind of different approaches to coaching, feel free to share them in the chat, and you can see here links or references, and these presentations about these approaches are all on the Global Reading Network website, where you can find out more details. So coach preparation and support, like teachers who we focus on quite a bit in our programs, coaches also need continuous professional development opportunities. They need training, they need resources, and they themselves need coaching. Some key research findings from both low-income and high-income contexts on how to best prepare and support coaches, finds that not too surprisingly, coach training should exhibit the same characteristics that have been identified as effective for teacher professional development. And you see some of these best practices summarized here on the slide. In the context of early grade reading programs, some research on the effectiveness of different approaches or modalities of coach training is a little bit more limited. One small-scale study in Sierra Leone explored coaches' perspectives of their own experiences in professional learning while participating in an early grade reading program funded by DFID. The coaches who had very limited prerequisite skills and knowledge around coaching articulated the importance of learning about their role, really understanding new pedagogical and content knowledge related to early grade reading, understanding how the coaching role differs from the supervisory role. So, actually teaching that and not just assuming that it will kind of be understood. And this research also found that coaches valued competency-based professional development, multiple opportunities to learn, resources and tools to support what they were doing, and opportunities for peer collaboration. So that's a nice research study, I think, that actually really focused on asking the coaches what they appreciated and what they needed to support, their work. Coaches often participate in the same training that teachers receive. Maybe it's, again, to learn about the program, to learn about instructional approaches to reading. Increasingly, coaches are also receiving coaching themselves. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about kind of monitoring and supporting coaches in the schools. So a couple of key takeaways in terms of recommendations and guidance that we've distilled from across the programs is, first and foremost, identifying coach learning needs. Not all coaches in all contexts are the same. And so, gathering information about what they learn, baseline surveys of coach knowledge and skills can be helpful in targeting the training, making it very context specific for what you're expecting coaches to do. And again, providing coaches with these multiple and diverse opportunities to learn, and really staggering that. So sometimes we're such a push to, of course, roll out programs in time for the school year, and we train a coach and give them everything and send them on their way. But bringing them back at opportune times to maybe do more in-depth training around a particular aspect of their work, because then they will also have had time to be in a school and to really understand where their gaps in knowledge and skills are. I know trainings that have, for example, just focused on the pedagogy and then brought coaches in later to train them on, use of a tablet that they were expected to use. So staggering it, scaffolding it so that coaches can really go out with the information and skills that they need. Support in terms of resources is really essential. Information outlining their roles and responsibilities, these classroom observation or protocols and different support tools, guidance on how to provide feedback. These are all things that need to be developed and really field tested with coaches to see how well they support coaches, to see what needs to be adapted or not. So in handout 9, you'll find a summary of guidance and considerations for training coaches. The presentation here from Madagascar also summarizes some of the best practices that Madagascar found for training their school-based coaches, which is, again, interesting to see how that might differ. And then in the coaching resource I mentioned, there's also there's an entire section on this topic too. So technology is also a resource that's increasingly used to support coaches in coaching. This can be useful to support inexperienced coaches in terms of technology being able to provide, for example, feedback tips based on information that the coaches record when they're observing teachers. They record it on the tablet, and a coach checks, for example, whether the teacher taught a specific skill or not, and the quality of that instruction. And if the coach says no, then they can get some feedback tips that they can provide to the teacher. So this may be a useful scaffold when coaches are really brand new, they themselves have not taught early grade reading. Monitoring coaches themselves, technology has been used to keep track of coaches, to see if they are visiting the schools as intended. There's been some, presentations from Kenya, some of you may be familiar with, on how they use tablets to in turn reimburse the coaches for their travel to the school, and you only get reimbursed if there's a verifiable piece of data that says you were in the school you were supposed to go to. A couple funny anecdotes about coaches being in like another country sometimes when they should have been observing schools, so that can be useful. It can also help to facilitate timely and accurate data collection and analysis. At CIS this year, we had a panel on coaching, and it did talk about how some of the research and analysis around coaching is because we do have electronically collected data, and that just really helps to collect the data and to analyze it in a timely manner. It can be used to inform ongoing teacher professional development. In my personal experience, several years ago in Nigeria on a pilot, we were able to quickly see the data coaches were uploading and then use that to inform these learning circles for coaches about what they felt they needed feedback, more in-depth study on the challenges they were seeing with teachers in the classroom. So again, though, the management and planning has to be in place to really be able to use data in an effective way. So using technology to collect data for the sake of it without a plan for the use is, of course, not something we want to happen. And providing remote support to teachers via SMS as a form of sort of distance coaching. A non-USAID program in Kenya has done this. I believe in Malawi we have some resources just on technology. If any of you have done that, I think that shows some promise in terms of being a way of creating virtual learning communities of teachers saying they really like that support and, feeling like they're part of a community of practice that they may not necessarily be able to physically be a part of. The handout 10 talks about technology use in Kenya and some both successes and challenges around it. We have colleagues from Nigeria who I know might contribute that in Nigeria they've decided, at least in some parts of the country, not to use tablets, to have coaches use tablets, with basically concerns around the sustainability of that. They're looking at smartphones as a potential alternative. So I think a lot more is coming out as these programs are implemented, where we can share what we're learning in kind of a real honest way about what we should continue to invest in or not. Guidance and tools to support coach visits. I've mentioned these a few times already. Just taking a little bit of deep dive into the coach responsibilities during the school visit. You saw in the Nigeria video, there was a lot going on there with what a coach is expected to do. And I think what we're finding in a lot of programs is coach responsibilities really need to be realistic and feasible, and we need to monitor whether coaches are able to do all that's expected of them in a quality manner and in a way that what they're doing is really effective in terms of supporting the teacher. What they do needs to fit into the structure of a normal school day. And so if they're required to do things with the teacher that take them out of their classroom for too long or create a burden in any way to other personnel in the school, we need to reflect on that. This issue of coaches conducting assessment during school visits is also one that I know has been talked about within programs, that this kind of formal EGRA-like assessment may not always be the most appropriate. In that example that was from that video, we found that that was actually very difficult for coaches to do who were new to coaching. It took a lot of time. It wasn't necessarily particularly useful for them at that time in terms of providing feedback to teachers. I know one project that is cited in the coach resource said that, assessment sort of started to take over what coaches were doing, and they really tried to reorient the coaches to doing more formative kind of assessment, in the sense that they were just circulating in the classroom at appropriate times to see how children were reading, asking them to, do something from a lesson from the previous week, to just try to get their finger on the pulse of how children were doing in order to take something to that conversation with the teacher after about whether, students were really achieving the lesson plans. So the resource again provides some, handout 11 provides some resources and tools for coaching that you may want to consider for your programs. You probably have many of these. You might want to go back and kind of evaluate them. Are they, again, achieving what you hope to achieve? Are they effective? Are they something that can be sustained beyond your project? The frequency of coach visits and the dosage of them is like this big million-dollar question that ministries of education and donors and everyone really wants to know, and understandably so. I think we need to recognize that this is something that can be very difficult to pinpoint, and just because we say, for example, 4 coach visits a year worked in X country, that might not be the same for Y country. And so if anything else, I'd like everyone to go away with thinking about how they can monitor and evaluate whether the coach-to-teacher, coach-to-school ratios and the dosage of coaching in their countries is leading to the outcomes that you want. The recent research that Amy mentioned at the beginning from the US has found that the quality and focus of coaching might be more important than the actual number of contact hours in the US context. But in early grade reading programs, quantity we're finding really does matter. We found that in the research in Nigeria that how frequently a teacher was visited had measurable outcomes on their quality of instruction. And you can hypothesize a lot of this is really due to teachers who are very new to this. They get sent out in their classrooms and they do need that support. They do need somebody who's there. And even if that person might not necessarily be providing the highest quality coaching, there is some mechanism of accountability. For better or for worse, having someone visit them kind of supports this idea they need to be in the classroom, that they need to be using the materials. There could be some Hawthorne effect here, but we realize that for now, quantity matters, and we should be trying to understand how frequently coaches are actually able to get out into classrooms. Some recent research from Kenya was interesting because it found that coaches weren't necessarily visiting teachers as much as the whole program, and actually, which is at the national scale right now, assumed. And so in the end, teachers were getting, on average, 1 visit a year. So that leads to some questions and some, really thought-provoking conversations around if coaching is effective, if it's being implemented in that way. And also they did some analysis on where those visits are happening. So we know from Kenya, some other research in Malawi, that coaches are visiting urban schools more frequently. So if, again, the schools that are probably most in need are in rural areas and they aren't getting visited as frequently, we need to adapt what we're doing. But surprisingly, many programs that I've spoken with don't actually know how frequently teachers are visited. They have this kind of plan, but then nobody has the data to say, well, actually, this teacher was only visited once and this teacher was visited 10 times, and what do we need to do to correct, or how do we need to look at why that happened? Maybe it was for good reason. Maybe a coach recognized that a teacher needed more help and visited that teacher more frequently. But these are all really important questions to ask as we monitor, evaluate, and conduct some more research. So I've cited some recent research of interest that was just presented this spring at CIES, and some critical questions around monitoring evaluation. We have 2 handouts on monitoring and evaluation. Again, the resource we've produced has more narrative and robust discussion around that. And there's also a tool that program support staff or personnel from teacher training colleges can use to go and in turn monitor coaches. And so all of these, I think, are things that we want to encourage you to do if you haven't already done them. And again, I think there's a lot of clear step-by-steps that you can find in the handout and the other coaching resource. So I will end this discussion by highlighting handouts 14 and 15, also a summary of key activities to carry out and issues to consider when planning for coaching, and all the resources and references that were cited in the slides are included in handout 15. So I'm now going to turn it back to Amy, who's going to just lead us through a quick discussion of monitoring and evaluation more generally in continuous professional development.
So we'd like to start by just asking you, when you look across your continuous professional development approach, whether that is training for teachers, training and coaching, training and small community learning groups, whether you've been working with school principals or government, whatever kinds of training and continuous professional development you provide, what are the methods and tools that you have been using to monitor and evaluate different kinds of activities? And particularly, how are you monitoring the impact of those activities on how teachers teach and how well students learn? We're also interested in hearing from you about any research you've done at any stage in a continuous professional development program, and tell us about what you found out, because we, as Allison noted, we really are in need of additional research. So I think I'm going to move us on to, as Allison noted, a quick kind of overview summary of monitoring and evaluation for the larger continuous professional development program approach. So you can see on the screen, we're looking at the purposes for evaluation. Really, the purposes are multiple. One, we have to know whether our target audience knows what they need to know and have the skills that we need them to have to do the work. Then we have to look at how well they're doing that work, of course, and identify whether that is having an impact on student learning outcomes. Not only do we have to look at the input that we put in, the results for participant learning, how it impacts students, but also cost effectiveness, the feasibility of the program within the context, and the sustainability of that program, and then determine what, if any, changes need to be made to the structure, the approach, the content, the delivery modalities. There's a number of ways to look at what kinds of revisions or changes might we need to make. So some key considerations as you begin working in your program is that this monitoring and evaluation of professional development needs to be clearly laid out in your monitoring, evaluation, and results plan while designing the overall program, not after the fact. It needs to happen up front. Make sure you design it to help you identify the different modalities and doses, as Allison has talked about. What's the approach and what's the dosage that works best and is most feasible within the context in terms of having an impact on the things that you're trying to change. And then using appropriate methods and tools for different purposes. So when we talk about the different purposes, we have different methods and different tools that we need to use. And you can see here on the screen that we've laid out three basic kind of approaches: workshops, small group meetings, learning circles, and then coaching, and then the overall approach to teacher professional development. And it is a mix of both quantitative and qualitative measures that need to be used. We want to not only gather self-reported information, for example, participant surveys, and focus groups and teacher commentary, but we also want to do some direct observation, observing trainers in formal settings, even pre and post testing, which a lot of programs are engaged in quite frequently now in terms of testing prior to and after training, the kind of knowledge that has grown. Of course, this is not an assessment of the learner. This is an assessment of the quality of the training and the quality of the trainer. And then in coaching, Allison also referenced this idea of coaching of coaches, and a part of working with coaches and making sure they're able to do their job well and get better at it over time is being able to do some periodic observation of coaches, either by the government or by, say, district or regional government personnel, giving feedback to the coach, feedback coming up through the ranks from teachers, across the ranks from their peers, and coming down from those people who are responsible for ensuring that the quality of coaching is as good as it can be. And then if we look at the overall teacher professional development approach, it is necessary to get into the classroom and look at teachers' instruction. And it's necessary to have someone who knows what they're looking for and what they're looking at to be conducting those observations. And then taking a look at teacher work products and journals. This may sometimes seem like a cumbersome process. However, it actually can be well integrated into things like regional CPD meetings, or with coaches bringing in teacher product samples when they're coming for a coaching refresher training or for coaching of coaches. And then, of course, assessment of student learning as well is critical. So you want to look across your different program approaches, lay out the questions that you want to answer, and then come up with the methodologies based on the modality of delivery and the content and skills standards that you want to meet for different groups of stakeholders. So these are the key takeaways for today. If you'll take a look at them, these are the key pieces of information we really want you to take away with you today and apply in your work as you move forward. Continuous professional development requires a lot of time. It is not a one-time sit and get event. Teachers actually report that the most effective professional development for them is something that's organized based on their need and that is provided in small increments over time. And there's a lot of emerging evidence coming out on the characteristics of effective PD. You can find some references for this in the information and the print materials we've provided online. There also needs to be opportunities for people to engage in different ways, and practice, authentic practice, supported practice needs to be a part of both formal and informal continuous professional development. We talked earlier about a structured approach that's content specific and using best practices for professional development and adult learning, as well as being hands-on. One of the critical things I think here is this issue of ongoing support and monitoring. We tend to, in large-scale programs, look directly at student learning, which is exactly what we need to do. But we have to be able to connect the dots between what we are doing with and to adults and the results that happen for children in the classroom. And as we link down through that process, we have to connect those dots down through the impact we have on school leaders to manage and support and hold accountable program implementation in their building. We have to link down through from teacher training to teacher coaching to the impact on teacher practice, so that we can really draw a direct line between our program initiatives and approaches and the kinds of results we eventually do or do not see for student learning. So from my point of view, monitoring and evaluation in continuous professional development is one of the most important factors we need to be planning for. Allison, I'm going to turn people over to you for the closing.
Great, thank you, Amy. We know that was kind of a whirlwind crash course through CPD and coaching. The chat just, I think, has really shown that you're all bringing such great experiences and questions and curiosity to these issues. I hope that leads to, following through on some of these guidance, the recommendations around monitoring and evaluation and research, and that, you send us your reports and you send us any materials that will help us to have more informed discussions as we continue this work. You're always welcome to contact myself or Amy. Our email addresses are listed there. You can also email the Global Reading Network. We do see those emails and respond to them if you have questions or want to share materials. Just a quick shout out to an upcoming event that the Global Reading Network is having. If you are in the area, August 22nd and 23rd, there'll be a workshop on universal design for learning. This is a training on a toolkit we developed on how we can make our programs accessible and effective for all children, those with disabilities and other variety of needs and from a variety of contexts. So stay tuned for some details about that. That should hit your inbox if you are signed up to receive the Global Reading Network emails. If not, just go to the website and there's a place on the website that you can sign up. And, we love to continue the conversation on social media. If you're so inclined, we're on all of these different social media platforms, and we really would love to connect with you. LinkedIn is, I would say, probably our lesser known one. So come and join that. That's a great way to find colleagues, consultants, potential staff through the LinkedIn account of the Global Reading Network. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at an upcoming event.